tour. Helen ran a toxic tour. This is the second one in London. She ran one a few years back, and its origins are in the US, San Francisco, where this idea of taking the public on these sorts of alternative walks, particularly around environmental links to cancer, breast cancer, is sort of semi-established now. Just to let you know, the route that we're taking is sort of following a story. It's your day-to-day life. We're going to be heading for a shopping mall down the way. It'll take in the wider environment. Kind of the problem with this whole environmental story is much of what we're talking about is invisible. You know, you cannot, it's simply not there to see. So the idea is daily life, the wider environment, your work environment. We're going to end up at Parliament to talk a little bit about why this story isn't breaking through politically. There's about an hour's walking in all of this. Some of it's very pretty. So sort of an hour walking, hour talking. And we're going to say a little bit about our speakers at each of the locations. The tour the idea is to talk about cancer generally, but there will be very particular reference to breast cancer. I think that's all I need to say. I've known Helen since the late 90s. She's been campaigning on cancer prevention since 1995, so that's she's now a freelance campaigner and researcher at her own company, Wildcard. She worked as a health coordinator for 12 years at the Women's Environmental Network, which did fantastic work on mapping breast cancer across the UK, and was its co-director. She's worked at local, national and international levels, done a lot of work at the European Union on issues connecting women's health and the environment they live in and work in. She was co-founder of the Alliance for Cancer Prevention, which campaigns for the recognition of environmental and occupational risk factors in cancer.
So we brought you here because this is the actual cathedral of the new religion, which is shopping. Yeah? So we've come to worship the god of consumerism at the altars of its shopping mall. Consumerism actually drives the markets, and industry readily responds with products that are smaller, lighter, faster and convenient. Also disposable, smaller and ultimately cheaper, which is what people are really interested in. But they're only cheaper in terms of the purchase price. And the question is, what price are we paying really for the products we buy? And there is a cost. The cost is to our planet because of the resource use and waste, to our climate because of the transport and packaging issues and pollution, the cost of drilling, mining, plucking, chopping, picking and shearing for raw materials, the cost to workers' health, working with non-existent health and safety laws and conditions for pitiful wages, and also living in polluted communities. And the potential to pollute from cradle to grave from raw materials through manufacturing, resulting in the finished product and disposal. This drive to fuel the greed for cheap. This results in contamination without consent, and in the health impacts ranging from repo disorders and behavioural problems to asthma and allergies. And it's this cost we're here to talk about today, but in particular the cost of breast and other cancers. Now, we're all exposed to a cocktail of chemicals through our air, soil and water, at work, at school, at rest, at play, and there is a conservative estimate of 24% of human diseases and disorders that are due, at least in part, to environmental factors, which include chemical exposures at work. And this is a conservative estimate from the WHO. The WHO linked 28 different cancers to occupational and environmental exposures. And the International Agency for Research on Cancer have identified 449 chemicals and substances that are in regular use that are known, probable or suspected carcinogens. Now, many consumers believe that if it's on sale, it's safe. But we realise that nothing could actually be further from the truth, and we know this because in the EU there's about 70,000 chemicals in regular commercial use, and only about 10% of them have proper health and safety testing. Under the REACH legislation, which is the chemical legislation in Europe, which stands for Registration, Evaluation and Authorisation of Chemicals, 30,000 chemicals will be tested before 2018. But it's estimated that about 700 new chemicals make their way onto the market each year. So you do the maths in that. It doesn't actually work out. We're particularly concerned about certain chemicals known as endocrine-disrupting chemicals or hormone-disrupting chemicals. These have the ability to interfere with our hormones like estrogen or testosterone. And our hormones are regulated by the endocrine system, which is like the body's messenger system. Sending messages to and from cells that regulate everything that's essential and intrinsic to life. And these endocrine disrupting chemicals can bioaccumulate in us, in our fat tissue, and in the tissues of the animals we eat, both marine and mammals, and then be passed down unwittingly through the generations. And the top of the food chain is not us, but it's the human child. Although we've known about these chemicals since the early 1960s, from Rachel Carson, our Silent Spring, there is very little proactive regulation of them, and there is insufficient testing of these chemicals for these endocrine disrupting properties before they're released onto the market, if any at all. There are some 800 chemicals which are known or suspected of interfering with our hormones, and these chemicals can be found in a variety of consumer products, including clothing. And last year, Greenpeace tested 141 different items of clothing from shops found here, including Zara, M&S, H&M, Gap, Diesel, to name a few. And they found very high levels of hormone disruptors in the clothing, particularly one called nanophenol. And that's used during the manufacturing process, nanophenol alkoxylates, they're called. And also they found chemicals in the azo dyes used to dye fabric, which can be released later as a chemical called amines, which are cancer-causing as well. Also, when products are printed, they have plastic printing. There's chemicals called phthalates used to do this, and they can leach from the fabric during manufacture, during washing, and also during wearing. And phthalates are also used in a lot of personal care products that are also on sale here. Perfumes, aftershaves, creams, lotions, potions. And what they do is they carry fragrances. And they're also used to denature alcohol used in perfumes so that we don't drink it. They also used to soften plastics as well. There's also endocrine disrupting chemicals like bisphenol A, and you may have seen about this in the news about baby bottles. It's actually been removed from baby bottles now, but still it's used to line cans and in medical devices such as plastic tubing. So still babies and humans are exposed to this chemical. Its use is widespread. It's also linked to breast cancer as well, and Andrew will talk about this later in working women. What's a serious concern is these chemicals' ability to actually accumulate in places that no man-made chemicals should accumulate. There was 2 studies done fairly recently in the US and Canada that found 232 toxic chemicals. How many? 232 toxic chemicals in umbilical cord blood. 132 of them were reported to cause cancer in humans and animals. 110, they're toxic to the brain and nervous system, which is an issue if you're a developing fetus. 133 cause developmental and renal problems in mammals, and humans are also mammals. The chemicals found were things like brominated flame retardants, which are added to products to make them flame-proof, so we don't get hurt from them actually accidentally catching fire. And also PCBs, which were used in electrical devices and equipment. But these were banned in Canada in 1977, so this shows you how persistent these chemicals are. Also things called PFCs, which are used to line non-stick coatings for frying pans. And things like organic chlorine pesticides as well. All of the Earth inhabitants have the right to actually gestate in a healthy the environment free from toxic chemicals. Chemicals that are capable of travelling into the placenta and into the womb have no place in any product, no place in any workplace, or no place in any environment. 300 synthetic chemicals have been discovered in human body tissues, including breast milk as well. And again, none of these chemicals we should be finding any of these chemicals there. If a chemical has been found linked to cancer, cancer in workers, cancer in consumers, cancer in systems, cancer in animals, then it should not be used because I do not think it would work so I want to say that cancer prevention does not live in this procedure of consumerism. Thank you. We're going to leave a blue plaque here for the security guards to have fun removing to say that cancer prevention does not live here.
Well, we've got Maria with us. I'm going to give a little intro to Maria. She does great work at an organisation called Client Earth. It's a paper. Hold on, Maria, this is very rude. Is that right? Okay, Maria Arnold. She's at Client Earth, where she leads the Healthy Air campaign. That combines work to engage communities at the local level with policy advocacy at UK level. So basically, she's in that space of interface between what we'd like to see and the decision makers, the people that actually influence legislation at the end of the day. She was previously the health policy analyst at the Sustainable Development Commission. She's worked to embed sustainable policy and practices within the NHS, the Department of Health, which is coming next. She has a particular emphasis on the link between health and environment. She also has managed environmental and public health projects at Southwark Council. You want to get a little bit cosier and just so you don't have to shout too loud.
He's asleep, so she'll be fine. I was wondering how this dynamic was going to work. It's worked out very well. He's never been so obedient before in his life, but I appreciate his support.
Oh, yes. Good.
Oh, me? Okay. So, as Deborah mentioned, I work for Client Earth, and we're an environmental law organisation, and then we also lead the Healthy Air campaign. And the work that I do, because I'm not a lawyer, is not very typical for Client Earth, because traditionally we do the very kind of detailed policy and legal analysis, but in the case of air quality it seems to be really important to have that kind of public-facing angle and try and engage the public in the issue. So if you were to take a list of health issues, for example, take obesity, alcohol, smoking, air quality and traffic accidents, and ask most people which were the most important, you'll find that air quality never comes anywhere near the top of the list. It normally comes bottom. Actually, they surveyed 100 MPs recently, and that was exactly the pattern you saw. They rated it 4.3 out of 5, i.e. pretty much at the bottom. In fact, it's second in that list in terms of the premature deaths caused. So air quality in the UK causes 29,000 deaths every year, and that's more than obesity and alcohol combined, and yet you just don't see the discussion about it. And so you can kind of forgive the public for not being aware of it because government never talk about it. And when you see that they're completely failing to hit all the legal targets which are established at EU level but with reference to WHO standards, you see why they probably prefer just not to mention it. They much prefer to stick to the kind of obesity, smoking angles where they can really put the onus on the individual to take action rather than the government. So I'm quite enjoying having this discussion on the steps of DEFRA. So that's the Healthy Air campaign exists to raise awareness of this issue because we see that as one of the major obstacles to progress. Most of the 29,000 deaths are cardiovascular related, but in addition to the kind of strokes and heart attacks caused, there's also lung cancer, respiratory disease like asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. There are low birth weights associated with air quality, and there's a lot of very strong evidence, and the most recent is coming directly out of London in Tower Hamlets and Hackney, that children growing up near busy roads are entering adulthood with smaller lungs. And that's something that they can't regain in later life, and it is a big predictor of life expectancy. So we see that as being really important, and sometimes people don't necessarily relate to kind of a figure of statistical deaths, because it isn't 29,000 people dropping dead, but it is 11.5 5 years of life lost per death. But something like smaller lungs in children, we find that the public tends to respond to more, and it's kind of unquestionable that that's not really something that should be happening. The main cause of this air pollution is traffic, and within that category, diesel is by far the biggest problem. So diesel causes far, far higher levels of emissions of two of the most harmful pollutants, which are particulate matter, and that's just very tiny particles in the air that kind of penetrate deep into the lungs and cause problems there, and nitrogen dioxide. The WHO declared diesel emissions as carcinogenic last year in recognition of the evidence for causation of lung cancer. And also, there's issues of government policy actually pushing diesel development. So in 2010, for the first time, we had more diesel vehicles bought than non-diesel vehicles, and that's because of incentivisation through tax and things like that, and it's really going in the wrong direction there. Hello.
No, I'm just listening. I thought I'd listen in.
That's fantastic. Just want to make sure we're not in your way.
I thought I'd learn something.
Yeah, we're talking about air quality and the impact on health.
Well, I'm sorry, but I'm just having a quick smoke.
Okay.
I'm not allowed to smoke in a building no more.
Yeah, well, let's not get into that. So at Client Earth, we work from the EU level right the way down to community engagement at the London level. In the EU, they're currently reviewing air quality policy, and we're really, really concerned about government's angle in these negotiations. They are lobbying for these legal limits to be weakened, basically, and we think they need to be strengthened. There's a recent report come out of the WHO that says that significant health impacts can happen if we let the legal limits. We're not even reaching the legal limits in 40 out of 43 zones across the UK. We are failing to meet the legal limits for nitrogen dioxide, and actually 16 zones, which are largely the biggest cities across the UK, won't reach them until 2020, and in the case of London, 2025. And the original deadline was 2010. So we're looking at 15 years of delay on this, and yet those limits, although everyone knew they were coming and everyone knew they'd have to deal with them. So at Client Earth, because we're an environmental law organisation, we've taken DEFRA to court on failure to meet these legal limits. It's been a quite long process. It's been going since 2010, and it's gone through the High Court and then the Court of Appeal. We didn't get very good responses there. They referred to the European Commission being the one that should be enforcing the law, which is technically wrong, legally speaking. And so we had a good result in May of this year when the Supreme Court made a formal declaration that government are failing in their responsibility to protect the public from the health impacts of air pollution. The problem is that it's very complex legally speaking, and they've had to refer some of the more complex questions to the European Court of Justice. That's going to involve, even if we get expedition and the whole thing speeded up, at least another year. But it does mean that the result will then impact all the EU member states. So it's quite exciting, although we have to just take the case as it comes. But they have also made a declaration that leaves the way open for national and European level enforcement. So that means that there is the possibility of massive fines coming down from the European Commission. That's not what we've been pushing for. We've been pushing for action above all that. So that's what we're doing at the national level. We're also doing some work to advocate particular policies, like we would like low emission zones in every single large town and city in the UK that will keep out the dirtiest vehicles. This is something that government have evaluated, found to be the most cost efficient method of reducing air quality, but yet they refuse to go ahead on the basis that it's too expensive for industry. By that they mean a particular kind of industry, because it would actually boost the greener industries, but they're always looking for one kind of industry, as we know. But that's our kind of national and European level policy. But what we're doing with the Healthy Air campaign is trying to increase public awareness, because that's the number one reason why government can get away with doing so little on this, because no one really asks them about it. And when people do start to be aware, they feel that there isn't they don't really feel empowered to do anything about it. So one thing that we try and spread awareness is that even within London, even within the centre of London, you can do a lot to reduce your own personal exposure just by thinking about the way that you walk.
Thanks very much. It's been emotional.
Me too.
Emotional, no?
So King's College London did a study, and they walked two different routes between Waterloo and the British Museum. One was slightly longer but went along quieter roads, and there was half the level of exposure to dangerous pollutants in that way of walking. And so it is really worth, and you have to be practical, you can't necessarily do it all the time, but it is worth thinking about when you're not in a massive rush, thinking about staying off the main roads. And so we do work with communities kind of mapping pollution in their area, mapping some of these routes so they can see it firsthand. Because as Helen mentioned earlier, these things are invisible, so it's really hard for people to relate to them. And particularly with air quality, we've got the kind of reference point in history of the London smog of the 50s, and so people think, oh well, we can't see it anymore, so it's obviously that's not a problem. And government do help to keep that kind of attitude going, and everything you see that government writes starts in the 50s it was really bad, but now we've pretty much got it sorted. And unfortunately that's far from the case. But so as well as encouraging people to reduce their own exposure and contributions to air pollution, we also encourage people to start to make a noise about it. Because of the review at EU level, there's going to be a lot of opportunities to put pressure on government. We're keeping an eye on them. One of my colleagues will be working in Brussels from September because of this review, and we're keeping an eye on exactly what the UK government are doing. And so we have a lot of resources on the Healthy Air Campaign website, which is healthyair.org.uk, on how to press your MP, your councillor, your public health officials in your local authority to start to take action. Because apart from government in general, in the health sector no one talks about it, despite being health people. It's a bit of a blind spot. But yet I feel like it's when we approach certain bodies, they have it in the back of their mind that maybe they should be doing something. So we feel like, and I hate this phrase, but we're pushing at an open door, and that people know the evidence is really strong and they know they should be doing something, but without any pressure they're simply not going to. So we are hoping to link up all the communities in the UK who are interested in this issue, and also who we are starting to encourage to be interested in this issue, so that we might have a bit of a coordinated push to pressure government. So that's all I was going to say, but I'm happy to take any questions if the other speaker's not here. I think there's some time.
If there's any questions from Dr. Yes. Are you linked up with some of the groups that are working against incineration?
Yeah, so we're working out how to link with those, because they ask for very different policy asks. But yeah, no, we're working out how we might support them without the campaign being totally taken over by that, because it's a little bit, it's a little bit of a very localised issue. But no, we certainly want to kind of get as much public voice as we can and work out how we manage that. But yeah.
Is the fact that it's the European Year of the Air of any value at all?
Yeah, so that's this review of air, yeah. That's, I think it means a lot to politicians. I don't know what it means to other people necessarily. When people hear it's the Year of Air, they go, oh wow. But actually it means the EU review of policy gets a bit less exciting. But no, we're certainly trying to use that as an opportunity.
Camden Council had a display on their council headquarters on Newton Road with air quality, but it's disappeared now. There's just one bland thing about cycling is better, you know.
I think that their policy is that when air quality is particularly bad, they put up appropriate messages. So maybe
that
when
could be something other boroughs could do, because it certainly brings it home to you when you see it.
Yeah,
you know.
yeah. There's some
I
councils that are much
decided not
more
to do it,
progressive, and it is a bit of an issue because you do end up pointing to your own failures as government of any level. Although there's far too much emphasis put on local government, where a lot of the leaders are in national government's hand, but through localism they say, oh, it's all down to you. But yeah, there are some councils like Camden and Islington are quite progressive, and Wandsworth have been hassled a lot about it, so they're starting to think more about it. But yeah, I agree. If it can just appear more in public life and in the weather forecast, it's the same as pollen, except worse, you know. But yeah, it doesn't. So we were trying to work with the BBC weather and see if it might be.
They have over the last few years been showing air quality.
Yeah, it's on the website.
During the summer. No, during the summer they do it.
What, on the
actual weather forecast?
On the telly?
On the telly.
Oh right, yeah. Well, it's
pollen
not
count and air quality.
Okay.
But usually only in the summer.
Yeah, well it's actually an issue in the winter and the summer, but yeah. Oh, I haven't been aware of that, but it's definitely on the BBC News weather website.
And we're over the moon to have Professor Andrew Watterson with us. He's the Director of the Centre for Public Health and Population Health Research at the University of Stirling. He heads up the Occupational and Environmental Health Research Group there. Interests include occupational cancer prevention, fracking and biomass hazards. regulation of hazards and risks, costs of occupational diseases, PAR, I don't know what that is.
Participatory action research.
Participatory action research. That's what this is in a way. He's acted as an advisor to the WHO, World Health Organization, and is on the editorial boards of IJOEH.
Acronyms Anonymous. International Journal of Occupational and Environmental Health.
Okay.
Yeah.
Coming to this Pakistan,
Okay.
Andrew.
Right. I did check first thing what I'm meant to be talking about because I lost the details. I'm very well organised though. And it was primarily about primary prevention and linking up with the wider health issues. So it is very appropriate to be outside the Department of Health. I don't want to be parochial or nationalistic, but it is important to note as well that if we're looking at the UK, we are not looking at some of the ministries that we're looking at here. DEFRA exists for England. It doesn't exist for Wales or Scotland. I don't think it exists for Northern Ireland. The Department of Health covers only England. It determines policy in England. There are different policies in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And I think that's quite important in the context of how we address health issues, because there's a widening gap between these various countries. And I think that what underpinned the Department of Health for a long time on paper was a concern about social inequalities. People may or may not recall the Black Report, which came out a number of years ago, which said that the big issues on the health front and the public health front were about poverty, were about income and income distribution. That was in opposition to, I think, what was the line of Mrs. Thatcher's government, which was not about the main drivers, the economic and the social and political drivers. It was about individuals. So the previous Department of Health strategies, which is basically formed by the politicians, was about lifestyling and victim blaming, and the latest strategies at least pay lip service to the idea of circumstances, life circumstances, rather than lifestyle, which meant that your health was going to be influenced by your wages, by where you live, by class, gender and age, all of those sorts of things. Now there's a real tension within the Department of Health because what the professionals are meant to do may be in opposition to what the politicians want to do. And the civil servants effectively carry out that policy. And you may recall with the debates about Murdoch that a number of observers and a number of MPs use the American term about willful ignorance, that professionals sometimes, because of the pressure they're put under, adopt willful ignorance, that they know that research shows that health is formed by these social and economic factors, but if the government says no, we don't want to talk about that, we want to talk about individuals and lifestyle, that's the route that they go down. So there's a lot of tension within departments like this as to what they should do and what they do and what they in fact believe in. A classic example, of course, would be at the moment where the English government stresses that in fact it should be up to individuals about how they deal with the sorts of things that we've heard mentioned earlier. So if we're looking at cancer and we say that diet and food and alcohol and smoking are all big factors in cancer, and nobody's saying that they're not. Later on we'll say that there are many other factors that may be contributing to a much bigger percentage of those diseases. But if we say that those factors are influential, then you would expect government to take action with regard to the food industry, the alcohol industry, the tobacco industry, and so on. On paper, that's what a lot of the politicians in previous administrations said, but they didn't do anything. Now it's all, we don't want to interfere too much with the food industry. What we'll do is take voluntary action. So there's, again, we'll come back to it later, I think, right at the end, about what sort of cancer prevention policies do you want and how do you form them. Do you want clear guidelines and government enforcement and then decision making under that? or do you want to say, well, it's up to the individual? We'll just tell people who may be strapped for cash that rather than going to McDonald's and getting a cheap meal, you should be doing this, this and this, assuming that they can get access to those things. So there are quite a lot of issues there. All the health departments in Europe, and again I think it's really useful hearing the comments about DEFRA, because so much is being led by the European Union, and it may not be wonderful, but a lot of very good public health measures have come out, and quite a lot of measures that are very pertinent to cancer prevention have come out of the EU. But I think the line in Europe is very similar to the line in the World Health Organization. And some of you will know this sort of phrase. The World Health Organization talks about upstream medicine, I think we should talk about upstream health, and downstream medicine and health. And what the WHO and the EU says is that we should all be upstream. In other words, you look at what causes diseases and you prevent people falling ill. You don't wait for them to fall in the river of disease and try and pull them out and treat them for their illnesses further down. So there is a real tension at the moment between governments who really focus on the downstream side of things rather than the upstream side of things. Now, if you look at cancer and if you look at breast cancer, which we'll do in more detail later, it comes out quite strongly there, because the agenda, as Helen was referring to earlier, was a lot to do with, well, if you're a woman, have the right sort of diet, don't drink a lot of alcohol, don't smoke, don't exercise, and then everything will be fine, because that's where a lot of the key factors are. Ironically, quite a lot of researchers are saying, well, the issues may be genetic, so we need to consider those. And recently, quite a lot of people have been saying, if we're looking at the big cancer picture, we also need to look not only at genetics, but epigenetics. And epigenetics is about environmental influences on people. So researchers are saying, well, perhaps, the big agenda is what the environment is doing to us in different ways. Now, how we define the environment's, quite complicated, and there could be a social environment, a physical environment, and so on. All of these things may come together. So if you want to address the big health issues, what you need to do is join up those strategies in ways that can influence most people. Round the corner a little way from here was an epidemiologist called Geoffrey Rose, and Geoffrey Rose made the observation that if you wanted to affect public health, what you really needed to do was to look at large populations exposed sometimes to quite low-level effects of things, rather than small populations that were exposed to large effects. So if you're looking at large populations, small effects, in fact, you may well find that this is a major cause of disease. And if we're looking at cancer prevention, and if we're thinking about environmental and work environment factors, then perhaps that's where the focus, in fact, should be. So there are arguments about strategies, and there are arguments about politics. I'll give you one anecdotal reference, well, it's not anecdotal actually, about pesticides in the Department of Health. The Department of Health is meant to coordinate the work with regard to public health issues that go on across the board. So DEFRA may feed in expertise to the Department of Health. The Health and Safety Executive may feed in expertise. Sorry, it's the air pollution. May feed in expertise to the Department of Health, and then their officials decide what action should be taken. 1980s, 20 odd years ago, we were concerned about pesticides. We were concerned about herbicides. We were concerned about chlorinated herbicides. And we were concerned about 2,4-D, which is a phenoxyacetic acid herbicide. Oh, thank you very much. Cheers. These are the ones that were linked with Agent Orange in Vietnam. that had been sprayed. So that was a combination of 2,4,5-T and 2,4-D. And we said, there's a lot of evidence out there that indicates in the 1980s that 2,4-D was a possible human carcinogen, caused soft tissue sarcomas, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and other things. So we went along to the Department of Health and we talked to a medic there. And he said, all this stuff is very interesting, he said, and you may well have a case. But if the Department of Health once admits there's a problem with a chemical, this is like the hole in the wall of a dam. Everything else will go. So the Department of Health will never actually admit that there are problems. And if you run that forward then, we heard about Deborah and its line on diesel. For a long time in the literature, diesel has been known to be an animal carcinogen. The World Health Organization funds the International Agency for Research on Cancer, and that's the one that was referred to as saying diesel is a human carcinogen. So why now isn't the Department of Health in fact taking a lot of action with regard to diesel problems? The OECD, Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, that is saying the biggest agenda we've got globally is diesel. We're spewing out this carcinogen, which also causes major respiratory problems. It ought to be the top public health issue. You look at what's going on in the Department of Health, and you look at what's happening in related ministries, and you can't see any action. We could say the same about things like formaldehyde, which are in consumer products, which are in furniture and so on, but they should have a view about. They'll have their expert committees, they'll have the scientists, who I would argue in some instances are engaged in willful ignorance. They don't stand up and say there's a problem, they make recommendations. Ministers basically ignore them. The European Union says we need to take action on things, the Department of Health says no, that's not required. We heard about bisphenol A, where the French and the Canadians and all sorts of governments are doing things. Department of Health and the related ministers say, not a problem. What we need to do is not engage in upstream medicine. What we need to do is take action when every T is crossed and every I is dotted. So you find that departments like this are 10, 15, 20, 30 years behind in decision making on substances and processes that were known to be a particular problem. We are going to talk about breast cancer shortly, but I'll just give another example about a ministry like this should be doing things. So we know diesel is a carcinogen. Recently, research has been showing that shift work, in fact, may affect both males and females in terms of carcinogenicity. There's a case now underway in Canada where a woman toll booth attendant who worked shifts and therefore worked lots of nights was sat on a bridge between Detroit and Windsor with lorries going past every day taking tolls. She was exposed to high levels of diesel and also exposed to shift work, and she contracted breast cancer, and there wasn't a family history, there was no genetic element or whatever there. In Canada they're saying, oh, hang on, we need to look at what's going on there. We need to look at the standards that we set, we need to look at the policies that we develop. And over here, although there are lots of good people in this ministry, you don't in fact hear about what they're doing. And that's why I would also say, have a look at the UK-wide agenda. See what other countries within the UK are doing, because they have social injustice, health inequalities, environmental pollution somewhat further up the agenda, and are taking actions that I don't think is happening in England. So what we want, and we'll come back to it at the end, are UK actions by the Department of Health, DEFRA, not the Department of Transport, the transport bodies and so on. We want all of these things linked up that, yes, may address life circumstance issues, but they will also address physical environments.
Thank you, Andrew. Any quick questions? Questions anybody has before we move on? We're just actually going to go across, and we're maybe 3-4 minutes in that direction next. Just a question I have about lobbies.
Okay.
Does that mean that, for example, the oil industry diesel lobby is somehow strong. How is it that Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland can somehow move it further up?
They can somehow move it further up in terms of the big umbrella issue. So they're saying health inequalities is important. Social injustice is important. If we want to address public health, then we need to pick up these issues. In England, my understanding is that public health is being dismantled, but the resources for people who are keen on doing things are being reduced, and they're being marginalised. You know, people like John Ashton, who's been speaking up in Cumbria recently about things. He would be in a much stronger position in Scotland. So I'm not saying not necessarily on all specific issues they can act, but at least they're aware of it. The principles are there.
A little bit about occupational risk in terms of cancer. Working life and exposure, basically.
Okay, perhaps we can tie it up to the bigger picture again. Wow. Some of the water. You get lots of complex interactions. So when people were looking at cancer at the beginning, it was the sort of one-shot model. You get an external cancer-causing substance, it hits your body, and then that's it. If you like, those were the old days. Now what you get is this issue about multi-causality and complex interactions. And that's really important in the context, for instance, of cancers like breast cancer, but also the ones that we've been neglecting, so it would be prostate cancer for men. And with breast cancer, you know, there are issues like when menstruation starts, when menstruation ends, how many children that you have got, what your family history might be. These are all things that the breast cancer therapies focus on. But in fact, what might happen is that at different stages you could get different hits. And they're finding with these chemicals, endocrine disruptors that Helen referred to, I think, yes she did, right at the beginning, that they may in fact affect the woman when she's pregnant, crossing the placental barrier we had. They may affect an infant when they were young. They may affect a woman as she gets older. And we know about external factors, things like HRT and so on. They have been relatively well studied, although there are even debates there about what the effects would be. So where there are external insults, there could be effects. What a group of us at Stirling have been doing, in conjunction with some US and Canadian researchers, is to map through the work history of women who have certain types of breast cancer. And the work history, in fact, actually goes beyond the workplace, because it could be, and this is what we found in Canada, you could find that the mothers are exposed to potential breast carcinogens, bearing in mind that Rudell and others recently said there were 232 that they knew of that could cause breast cancer. So the woman might use it and could have exposed the child in the womb. Then the children live often in Canada in farming areas, and they may be involved where they're spraying, and there could be critical windows that may adversely affect them. So there could be adolescents, they could be 13, 14, 15, and they could get these insults. And then they could go into a workplace, they could work on a farm, and they would continue to get the insults from agrochemicals. Or what we found in Canada was that the women often lived on a farm, worked in the agricultural industry, and then went to work in the metal industry, in the health service, or in the car industry, which is why we're quite interested in Windsor. And in the car industry, we found they were using a whole set of plastics and polymers, things like vinyl chloride, and a range of other chemicals that in laboratory tests are known to cause breast cancer. And what we found as well in a study of over 1,000 women in the cases group against a control group of 1,000 women, so it was quite large. We got these detailed work histories. We found there was a 4-fold excess of breast cancers in the food canning industry. And the only thing that we could pick out that seemed to be significant there was the fact that they were plastics with bisphenol A, for instance, BPA, which again, evidence has been growing and growing and growing, so there's a consistent trend showing that it will affect human cells, and in those tests is a human carcinogen, and in laboratory tests is a human carcinogen as well. So what we're saying is occupation is grossly neglected in terms of looking at all cancers. But if you were looking, for instance, at breast cancer, the way of dealing it wouldn't be to stick a monitor on a woman and say, are the levels of exposure to the various chemicals that we've got are over the limit or not? Again, recent studies with some of these chemicals linked to the plastics industry have shown that the exposure levels can be met, that the exposures are lower than the official levels, yet the women have higher levels than you would expect of a number of these chemicals in their blood. So, having exposure standards won't work. What do? You focus on the woman and say, we'll unpack all of these things, and if you're genetically susceptible, you shouldn't do this, that, and the other. Or do we focus on the carcinogen and on those factors that may well contribute, the co-carcinogens, promote cancer, as well as the carcinogens as well? So what we're saying is, the smart thing to do is to go for the carcinogen rather than the cancer. Because again, there are many different sorts of breast cancer. Some are estrogen positive ones, some are estrogen negative ones, some are progesterone positive ones, and so on. So the biochemistry of that is extremely complicated. So it makes most sense, we think, to go for the carcinogen. Now, if you're looking at why we should do that and what focus there is on occupational cancers generally and on breast cancer in particular, what you'll find in the UK is there's a mismatch between what's going on internationally, what's going on in Europe, and what's going on here. Internationally, the World Health Organization, Europe and so on, are flagging up environmental and occupational causes of cancer as a big issue. And I would say you can't actually separate them off, because what happens in the work environment is going to slip into the wider environment. What we have seen, though, from the people who head this World Health Organization body in the past, the International Institute for Research on Cancer, Tomatis, who was the Italian head of it, made the point that when you look at the testing processes, even though Helen was quite rightly flagging that for consumers there's a lack of rigour, when you look at the workplace, there's even less rigour. So there's more testing done to protect the consumer, and if in doubt, there's a more likelihood that they will fail to safety and not clear something, even though we know a lot of very toxic and nasty things have come through. But if you look at the workplace, you find that level of testing doesn't go on. The estimate from the World Health Organization is that something like 7 to possibly 17% of all cancers in the world are environmentally caused. So that means what's in your wider environment and what's in your work environment. But if you consider who's going to be exposed longest to the highest levels of a substance, it's going to be people, in fact, in the workplace. So it's worth bearing that in mind. Although do have this caveat at the back of your mind as well, that we are talking about multiple insults. There's an occupational physician in the US, Wendy Champion, who coined the phrase double jeopardy. And double jeopardy is where a woman goes to work and is exposed to a whole range of hazardous substances, including carcinogens, and then she comes home, cleans the house, does a whole range of domestic tasks, and then gets another set of carcinogens. I think probably we should be talking about quadruple jeopardy, because we're talking about what people do in the home, what they do at work, what's in their wider environment, and then what might be, for instance, in the food and drink. So there could be a whole set of routes of entry of a whole range of carcinogens. But in the context of the workplace, the assessment has been historically that most occupational cancers pale into insignificance against these lifestyle cancers, what I would call the life-threatening. So this all goes back to the 1980s, when the US government commissioned a couple of UK researchers, voluntary stuff, to make the fractions of cancer that were due to the various elements. And Dolan Peto said that 4% or 4.5% of all cancers were down to work. And since the 1980s, there's been hardly any revision of that figure. Now, in the United States and in Europe, people are really seriously questioning that. In the UK, the Health and Safety Executive that deals with occupational work across the UK, so it includes Scotland because it's a matter reserved to London, they've started to do some re-estimates, but they're coming up with about 5 to 6% of cancers may be work-related, and within that you will find a number of breast cancer. What was interesting to me was that Dolan Peto, even when they produced the 4.5% figure, said, hang on a minute, 4.5% of the population at work getting cancer is a big issue. So even though, in our eyes, it isn't the biggest factor, nevertheless, we should be taking action on it. And if you look at what happened in the UK, there's been very little action. REACH, that Helen referred to, is going to be quite important, so there'll be more scrutiny. There are other regulations that are important. Control of substance and hazardous health regulations, and so on. A lot of this legislation, by the way, has gone to the European Union. It has been heavily resisted by the UK government. And of course, the UK government wants to weaken those sorts of regulations even further at the moment. And what other research say is that, in fact, the percentage of occupational cause and occupationally related, in other words, a direct link and an indirect link, occupational cause, occupationally related cancers is 13%. This is the European Agency for Safety and Health. Not a bunch of radical environmentalists, not a group of trade unionists, a mainstream European body. They're saying 13% of all cancers are down to occupation. Now, they have a very much smaller figure for women, significantly smaller. But would you believe that in the 1980s, Dolan Peto couldn't draw conclusions about the occupational cancers that women had because they didn't show up in the statistics? Because the standard response was, we take the man's occupation, we don't take the woman's. So it's only been in the last few decades that information has been coming out about that. The UK estimate just recently as well is that there are something like, there's several hundred deaths from breast cancer due to work. That was in their officially commissioned research. So you would think that would then trigger a big campaign. 550 deaths to women every year from occupation-caused breast cancer. And what does the British government say? Well, we're not too sure about that. The Danes have shown that shift work and breast cancer are linked and they're compensating people. Well, that's the Danes. We need to do our own research because I assume they think that British women are just Danish women in some respect, and they've actually kicked it into the long grass. So they're not doing anything. This is against the backdrop in terms of the pink ribbon campaigns and so on. We've seen a 70% increase in the number of women with breast cancer between 1970 and now. in the last full decade, between 2000 and 2010, there's been a 6% increase. We've seen the percentage of women with breast cancer rising all the time. So it's up to 1 in 8, you know, veering down to 1 in 7 women in a lifetime will contract that disease. I know a lot of the charities go on at the moment and they say, oh, prostate cancer is neglected. And I must say, as an older male now, whereas in the past, you know, the discussion's been who's had a breast screening scan or whatever, it's have you had a PSA test done, you know. So there are concerns about prostate cancer. But I still don't believe that if men had had the same mortality rate and had those sorts of figures 10, 15 years ago, that it would simply have gone by the board. People wouldn't have picked it up. So we're talking about very significant percentages of women contracting breast cancer. Bodies like Cancer Research UK and the World Cancer Research Fund are saying they reckon they can explain 48% of the breast cancer cases that occur. I think that is a little bit of a figure plucked out of the air, because they then go on to say where we were back in the past, well, it's down to alcohol, it's down to food, it's down to diet, everything. But effectively they've been saying for a long time that the majority of breast cancer is not explained. But whatever it is, it's not work and it's not the environment. So you juxtaposition that with the growing list of chemicals and activities, so shift work, although it may be acting biological, you know, it's a management system, chemicals, physical exposures and management systems that are known to cause cancer, definitely in humans or probably in humans. That list is growing. We hear more, and a lot of work has been done by this on the environmental groups about the endocrine disruptors that Helen was mentioning. And what we know with endocrine disruptors, according to, again, highly respected researchers in places like Tufts, you know, Ivy League universities in the US, is that minute quantities of these chemicals may have that effect. And if you look at where you're getting your endocrine disruptors from, males as well as female, because endocrine disruptors will hit the prostate, you're going to get them in the workplace, you're going to get them in consumer products, and there's a whole set of other exposures that may be there. So that's why bodies like the Alliance for Cancer Prevention and others are saying, you know, we need a new strategy to address this. There's been an under-prioritisation of prevention on breast cancer. There's this strange term called which is about secondary prevention, which is effectively screening. It's not prevention. I'm not in any way downplaying the importance of screening where appropriate and where it's effective. And we've seen a big debate about that, and the evidence from the scientific community seems to be shifting quite significantly about some of the hazards from the screening and less about the benefits. But you would think that the bodies like the Department of Health and others would have a strategy that could control these things. So we're in the BIS area. BIS doesn't cover necessarily all other countries, but it's incredibly important as the ideological driver of deregulation, what's euphemistically called better regulation. And what BIS wants to see is economic growth prioritised in public health bodies, in health and safety executive, in DEFRA, and so on. And it doesn't want to see precaution and prevention and inspection brought in. Just as we were walking along, I was saying that in Denmark, when the shift work and breast cancer results came out, they set their labour inspectors, who are the equivalent to our workplace health and safety inspectors, to work. They sent them out and they started enforcing the European regulations much more to ensure there weren't abuses on shift work, that there was proper health surveillance and so on. What we see with BIS is them reducing the emphasis given to even basic occupational health and safety activity, a lack of action on occupational carcinogens, inactivity on diesels, inactivity on endocrine disruptors and so on. It's basically not the precautionary principle they use. They say do it until we count the bodies. And if you're looking at workplaces, you often find that industries that produce these carcinogens have gone in 10, 20 years, and what's left are the people who are adversely affected, and they're on to another technology. So there must be better ways of doing it, and ministries like this are critical.
Okay. I want to try not to repeat all the wonderful stuff that's been said, and it's been absolutely brilliant to hear all the other speakers. That's fantastic. But I just wanted to remind us that we estimate that at least 20%, probably more, cancers are caused by occupational and environmental exposure. But even if we take a very moderate 12% of cancers as being caused by work, that's 18,000 deaths a year. That's an enormous number. And again, as we heard about the air pollution, that's not one that you would hear. So it's caused by chemicals that people are exposed to at work, and also shift work and other things like that. So that's an absolutely enormous number. That doesn't come from us, that comes from other experts. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what trade unions should be doing about tackling occupational cancer in the workplace. But before that, I have to really just remind everyone, in case you don't know, that currently we are in a situation where the government is attacking the whole health and safety regulatory and enforcement environment. So the laws that workers fought for hundreds of years, and the enforcement systems that we've built up to make sure that employers obey those laws, they're all being broken down and rolled back. And the people who are inspecting employers to make sure they are complying with even the most basic laws have been cut tremendously. Everything is under attack. And what has happened as part of this is that occupational health, the sort of things that, all the things we're talking about in terms of cancer, that has absolutely been wiped off the agenda. So when we're talking about what can trade unionists do, you have to understand that it's in that environment whereby not only they're fighting for their members for jobs and pensions and wages and all the rest of it, and trying to fight also for their health and safety, but they're fighting in a situation where the government is actually removing regulation and enforcement on employers to make them comply, to make them provide safe and healthy workplaces. And it's not at all, the government is not at all interested in doing anything about occupational health. Helen and I attended an HSE, the Health and Safety Executive Conference on cancer and occupational diseases recently. We protested outside because they're dithering, delaying and denying about all sorts of occupational cancer, particularly about women's cancer and breast cancer. We demonstrated outside and then we went into this conference. And it was the most complacent conference you could possibly imagine in terms of what they're doing, and even in terms of specific things like shift work and so on. The attitude is very much that what they're doing is all about right, and what they're doing is absolutely nothing. So you must be aware that that's the situation in which workers find themselves and in which trade unions find themselves. But that's not to say that trade unions shouldn't be doing a great deal more. Some trade unions are doing quite a lot on cancer. For example, my own union, Unite, and the GMB, they're doing work on diesel exhaust emissions for drivers and delivery workers and all the rest of it. And those unions in UCAP, construction workers unions, are doing a lot of work on asbestos and on silica dust and things like that in their workplaces. Unison and the Royal College of Nursing are beginning to do some work on shift work and with breast cancer, and he's just talked about it, a great thing. The teaching unions are doing quite a lot of work with other unions on asbestos in schools, because an unfeasibly large number of people who work in schools, which is not an environment you think they've been exposed to asbestos, are dying. So there is some good work being done, but in general, I actually think the whole work of trade unions on occupational cancer has really gone off the boil, and nobody's really setting the agenda or speaking out very clearly about it. And I think that is what trade unions could be doing much more of, raising the issues, raising the profile, raising awareness of their members in the workplace and actually at the public outside, and talking about these issues a great deal more. So, for example, when, as Andy and other people have said, when the World Health Organization actually came out and said that diesel exhaust emissions are a definite human carcinogen, I don't think trade unions made enough of that, and what that meant or could mean for their members. And if we're not saying that, then we're not pushing anybody else to do that. And what also we can be doing is, at the moment, the government hasn't removed a very good piece of legislation we have called the Control of Substances Hazardous to Health, COSH. And these regulations, actually they're very, very poorly enforced. These regulations say that all employers have to assess the risks of all chemicals in their workplaces for any risk risks they pose to workers' health. And if they pose a risk to workers' health, carcinogens, enzymes, all these chemicals, then they immediately have to look at eliminating them if they can. If they can't eliminate them, they have to look at substituting something safer. If they can't do that, then they have to look at engineering controls to reduce the exposure of all the people in the workplace, collective prevention measures. And only as a last resort can they put people in personal protective equipment. And those regulations have been there since 1998? 1998, I think? Yeah. 88. I think 1988. But they're incredibly badly enforced, and yet if they were enforced, then an enormous amount could have been done in terms of substituting carcinogens and other chemicals. And that could have been done over the last 20 years. A huge amount of work could have been done. And I also think not only is it the enforcement authorities that have failed there, but also trade unions failed to actually really fully use that. There's lots and lots of information out there, brilliant guides about, occupational cancer, what safety reps can do, that trade unions, and this is one that Rory O'Neill from Cancers magazine did. There's loads of work about what chemicals cause what sort of cancers and what processes they're used in. But a lot of this information isn't getting out to the members, the workers in their workplaces. And there isn't really enough support on getting them to carry out the inventory and making sure that the employers are actually doing those risk assessments, identifying the carcinogens, because there are carcinogens in all the workplaces, and then doing something about them. And the same is also true really of shift work. But then there are lots of other things that have been done in other countries, things like toxic use reduction programs, where trade unions could get much more behind the idea that we're trying to get all hazardous chemicals out of workplaces, and let's look at how we can reduce these. And in some states in America, they actually have laws that help them to do that. And we could be arguing for sunsetting for those toxic carcinogens and other chemicals and saying, we must work towards that. So in 5 years' time, we must get rid of that. And then trying to put pressure on, chemists and people to design better chemicals so that will replace them. And more information about alternatives. There are very good websites. There's one in Europe called Subsport, where you can go onto this website and you can look up the chemicals that you're using and look up safer alternatives. There are lots of things like that. And we should also be looking at zero uses of chemicals. We just use as few chemicals as we possibly can. And that also plays into the whole green agenda, plays into the environmental agenda. So I think we haven't, as trade unionists, we probably haven't argued enough for this, and we haven't pushed the employers, and we haven't pushed the enforcers enough on this. But it's undoubtedly true that we need a regulatory and enforcement framework that's very strict and actually works, but then actually drives innovation and drives change and drives manufacturers to come up with safer chemicals and safer processes. There are all sorts of ways in which this can be done. And some of these are very simple. For example, in laboratories, they used to use in Denmark. They used to use acetone in the final wash, so that it would evaporate, they would dry quickly. And so the lab assistants union came up with the idea, well, why don't we just buy 3 times as much glassware? And then things can dry as slowly as they like. It's a very simple, but quite an elegant solution. And where workers are involved in those solutions, and where there's a framework set up where we actually say it's not good for workers to be exposed to any chemicals in excess, it's certainly not good for them to be exposed to carcinogens, then we can encourage workers to do that. That framework doesn't exist, it isn't being imposed from government. Andy and various other people have told you how our ministries and how our government are letting us down in that, and that is actually a big problem. But I also think that trade unions, we have to, and the Hazards Campaign, we have to make more links between workers and communities on all these chemicals. If chemicals are being used in manufacturing processes, like plasticizers, like bisphenol or whatever, and then they go out into the community, and then they're getting into people's food and water and so on, then we have to be involved in all of that, and we have to be making common cause with community groups and doing very more on that. and speaking up much more loudly. I don't think the trade unions are really taking on board the idea about any kind of disrupting chemicals yet. We're pushing that quite hard and doing as much as we can, but I don't think they really have got that far at the moment. But we have to push the posh hierarchy, elimination, substitution, engineering controls, toxic use reduction, zero use of chemicals, and we have to push the precautionary principle, and we have to talk about much more about inequalities, the health inequalities, social inequalities that actually expose some workers are exposed multiply to a lot of these chemicals in their workplaces and in their environment. And we have to be talking about all of that and talking much more openly and challenging exactly what's been going on. So I think there is a lot of good work that's going on, but much more we could be doing. I don't really think we're doing enough, but we are in a really vile environment at the moment where this government doesn't give a fuck for our health. I'm sorry to swear. Doesn't give a sod for our health. We can all die anywhere, at work or wherever. They don't really care about us at all. And they are setting a framework for health and safety at work, which will mean, in fact, that more people are going to be exposed to more chemicals and more harmful substances and work ghastly shifts and all the rest of it. And it's going to be absolutely dreadful. I just want to really end with the fact that this is one of our colleagues, Simon Pitmans, who works in Sheffield, and he set up a pioneering way of looking at workers' health.
Sorry.
It's all right. Which was working in doctors' surgeries, talking to people when they came in with their health problems, taking work histories from them, and then discussing these work histories with the doctors, so that the doctors have more idea about why people are ill, what's causing it, and then they tried to work with trade unions and people locally in terms of tackling some of those issues. And they did really brilliant work, and through that work Simon identified all sorts of low-level exposures to chemicals and mixed exposures to chemicals that cause cancers, especially bladder cancer, but a whole range of other cancers that the HSE, the Health and Safety Executive, will not accept is actually existing. He knew far more about cancer and has given us tools to reveal this, which are much more sensitive than the rather crude epidemiological studies, which actually look at small groups of people, or people in workplaces where they've worked for 30 years, rather than huge numbers of people doing a whole range of work being exposed to small exposures. And he actually died last year of mesothelioma caused by asbestos because he worked on a building site to raise money while he was actually doing this pioneering work, which reminds us of where we come back to. So thanks very much.
Is there any questions? It's a question about personal data. Lots of people are obsessed with personal data and tracking their own data, whether they're going to restaurants, they're going to orders of grill and things like that. Is it easy for us to be able to do our own life histories? Is there something on your website that would allow an ordinary person without the knowledge to do their own kind of mapping of what they're exposed to?
Yes, I think so. I mean, we can certainly give you some of those sources. I mean, our websites don't have things that make that necessarily easy, but we have lots of information, certainly about cancer, about the sort of chemicals and sort of work in the sort of workplace and the relationship, and then what sort of cancers those might lead to. And you could actually do that. Yes, that's actually a very interesting idea. It might be something we ought to really think about a bit more carefully about how we could make that easier for people to do.
You could go to a hack day or something and charity to get someone just to build an app.
Yeah, that's a very good idea. Are you good at that sort of thing?
No, but I've gone to some and
no, but I think that's we probably need to be thinking a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, Hazard's web pages has information about the lay investigation of problems, so you can look at occupational diseases and when, and in the past, and Helen in particular, stuff on mapping as well.
Body mapping.
So where you're going to have to your life histories, but you can also look at what goes on in a workforce and what goes on in a community. So there is information.
So if you go to www.hazards.org and then DIY research will give you the hazards mapping and the body mapping. There also are cancer pages there, which will give it to you both ways, which will give the workplaces and the sort of chemicals that we use, and it will give the cancers and the sort of chemicals that can cause that. And there's also access to this sort of safety test. So there is actually quite a lot of information. That's actually, we have been talking about that. We're all getting old, you see. We're not sort of savvy, but lots of people, young people, are starting to talk to me about, do we have an app for that? And then we need them to do it. We need them to help us, because I think we have a lot of information there, actually, which in the new age is probably becoming a bit, it's not the way people assess information. We are going to have to think about that. So thank you for that.
It's a bit ancient.
I know.
I was walking up a hill in the middle of the week and somebody said to me, there's an old bloke walking behind you. I thought, that's all right. Just a point about regulation. Clearly it's important in terms of public health and to protect the workforce. But there's a lot of evidence shows that regulation works and that voluntary controls don't. There's a lot of work being done in the US about voluntary prevention programs, which is what the government here is dead keen on. So we'll just roll it out, there'll be self-regulation, good
employers will do
and so on.
employers know what to do.
And the evidence shows that that doesn't work. And the evidence shows that where you get good regulation, you get high standards, you get innovative activities, you get entrepreneurship. And in fact, those companies and those employers that do that prosper.
Benefit.
So it's the other side of the coin. Regulation could be. Nobody's suggesting enforcement of regulations that just interfere and don't have an effect. But what Hilda was talking about are things that benefit us, that benefit our communities. I think you could say about. You could argue the guinea pig effect as well, because what affects workers later on at lower levels, longer term, will probably be affecting us.
The community.
Why on earth isn't this issue punching through? What's standing in the way of decision makers in there acting on all that you've heard about today? This isn't new news. This has been around in terms of the accumulation of information and research around exposures, impact on human health. It's been around a long time. It's not being acted on. And one of the things that I thought would be interesting for us to have a bit of an insight into in terms of what it is we're up against is to some degree look at the lobbying, look at the pressures that are put on our elected representatives to either mask the issue or dominate the issue in terms of the thinking. I mean, we've seen the degree to which Andrew's talked about how you've got tensions within government departments, policies out there, good policies out there, when it could be implemented. Now, I came into this in 1997, just after the Tony Blair election, and I saw a documentary program called Lindane Legacy, and it was looking at this one particular chemical, Lindane, and following it through the food chain, looking at the research in the US and Israel in those early days. And what it pointed to was it was definitely a factor in the promotion of breast cancer. It's an estrogen mimicker. And I looked at this and the scales fell from my eyes, and I thought, we've got a house full of women MPs. This needs to be in their inbox. It needs to be in their in-tray. So my first action on this was to get a screening of the film over there. And what I discovered was there was already, to pick up on the Union point, there was already a campaign underway led by Unison, the Ban Lindane campaign that was starting to come together, Women's Environmental Network, Pesticides Action Network, Soil Association, starting to form around this Ban Lindane campaign. 5 years later, the point I want to make about this campaigning works, Lindane was banned. The European Union, that is the EU, they banned it. Now, at the time that I was organising this screening in there, my MP was Anne Keane. She was a newly elected Labour MP. She had been a nurse. She was in the health department, advising, I think it was Frank Dobson, Health Minister. Her PA said to me, environmental links to breast cancer, Lindane, this is very interesting. I had no idea there was such a concept as environmental links. She said, because we have a constant trail of drugs companies coming in to lobby Anne Keane. So I just want to talk you through connections that are between the all-party parliamentary groups that sit in there that say they have an interest on breast cancer, cancer and health, and just see where the support, the backroom support is coming from, the steering, guiding, influence of how policy is shaped, and how actually it is very difficult to punch through to your average MP on this. This is bearing in mind what we all know. We've heard about the WHO, we've heard about chemicals in the environment, we've heard about a never-ending stream of research that's out there. Do you all know all-party parliamentary groups are just, there's hundreds of them. Any MP can join, and they're interest groups. So it can be APPG on beer, there's an APPG on genocide, Great Lakes, they're all across the board. There's lots on health. So the all-party parliamentary group on breast cancer is administered by Breakthrough Breast Cancer, which is a big charity, that gets sponsorship. Breakthrough gets sponsorship from Avon. So remember, Breakthrough is administering for the all-party group on breast cancer. Sponsorship from Avon, we've been down the cosmetics line. And drugs companies, including Novartis and Roche. Roche donated £2,500 to the Breast Cancer APPG annual dinner, £10,000 to support its work through its campaign advocacy networks, £7,500 for an annual reception, and Roche also gave £15,000 to Breakthrough Breast Cancer to organise a campaigners and advocacy network meeting. The vice chair of the all-party parliamentary group on breast cancer is Baroness Deleth Morgan. She's a long-time breast cancer campaigner who oversaw the growth of Breakthrough Breast Cancer, which is obviously now a major player. She's now chief exec of a research charity called the Breast Cancer Campaign. On the Breast Cancer Campaign's website, it has a page that lists risk factors for breast cancer, established risks, possible risks, and doubtful risks. On the doubtful risks of breast cancer page, it says factors that are not thought to affect your breast cancer risk include deodorants and antiperspirants, but more importantly, pesticides and other pollutants. Bear in mind all you've heard today from Andrew, Hilda, Helen about the research that's out there. They say there is no convincing or consistent scientific evidence linking exposure to pesticides or other pollutants to an increased risk of developing breast cancer. Many studies, I suggest they look at the WHO, many studies have looked at different pesticides or pollutants and their effect on breast cancer risk, but as we are exposed to low levels of many different pesticides or pollutants over a lifetime, it is difficult to know which, if any of these, influence risk. So out goes the precautionary principle, out goes low-level lifelong exposure, shameful. So let's the all-party parliamentary group on cancer. Deleth Morgan is also a member of this. They are administered by the Macmillan Cancer Charity. Macmillan Cancer Support. Macmillan Cancer Support receives donations from GlaxoSmithKline, Roche, Novartis and Pfizer. The all-party parliamentary groups on chemicals, there's one on chemicals, they're administered by the Chemicals Industry Association, the largest organisation that represents chemical and pharmaceutical businesses, representing all shapes and sizes of chemical and pharmaceutical businesses. On Friday, so these are the people, the APPG on chemicals, tweeting about shale gas and fracking. The Health All-Party Parliamentary Group, they're serviced by an outfit called Policy Connect, which acts as the Health All-Party Parliamentary Group's secretariat. They have received £8,500 membership fee from each of the following: AstraZeneca, Bristol Myers Squibb, I'm going through a long list, GlaxoSmithKline, Novartis, Pfizer and Merck. And I go back to 1997 when that PA to my MP said, blimey, environmental links to breast cancer, it would never have occurred because all we have is this stream of drugs companies lobbying. So we have to say, is it any wonder that no one is taking any notice of the precautionary principle, or that just recently this week they've agreed to offer tamoxifen an estrogen-reducing drug to 500,000 women, 500,000 women in this country who don't have breast cancer are being offered an estrogen-reducing drug while willfully ignoring our lifelong low-level exposure to endocrine-disrupting chemicals, hormone-disrupting chemicals. You add that to media ignorance, absolute saturation of pink everywhere, which kind of brings back to Breakthrough and all party groups and that kind of influence. And the fact that fundraising is almost, in terms of the general public, entirely linked to finding a cure, racing for cure treatments. Is it any wonder that our side of the argument is persistently closed down, eclipsed by this prominent discourse of drugs companies, mainstream cancer charities, business, and by extension government? But I just want to, so I think it's really important that somehow, my background is actually more on development campaigning, on tax and trade and debt. When you mobilise people and you shine the kind of spotlight of numbers on this issue, and you start to lobby there, you can break some dams. And I give an example of taxation right now. In 2007-8, we were trying, I was working for the development agency, we were trying to get people to pay attention to the hemorrhaging of tax avoidance and tax evasion by big corporates, sub-Saharan Africa. Tax, you couldn't give it away. It was unsexy, it was boring, it was, then a number of events come together and suddenly tax is there, it's almost sexy. But it's about numbers, and I think we all somehow have to think about how we can update the issue, modernise the language to some degree, and start to maybe, one of the things we can think about is to emulate some of the development agencies' work, which are mass mobilisations of that place. You get 5, 10, 15,000 people mobilised on an issue, whatever we choose that issue to be, and just keep coming back, because what they can't stand and what business can't stand is bad PR and the kind of shaming and naming that comes with that. So I think I'll wrap up there and say that we're going to finish, I think, probably in the best place. This whole thing has been called Pink to Prevention, and it's been inspired by this effort to try and push against this pink. And Anna's going to kind of wrap up for us over the Emmeline Pankhurst statue.
Here about the politics of breast cancer now, last but not least, from Anna Porche-Esquardo. Anna is a dedicated activist in education, gender and health, and she's initiated workshops and campaigns on gender violence. What fascinates her is the powerful combination of activism, art and innovation methods. She's a member of the Breast Cancer Consortium Advisory Board, an international platform dedicated to changing the conversation on breast cancer through public and scientific discussions. And she's currently organising a series of sessions on breast cancer awareness in Brighton, and invited me down, thank you to Brighton, for a screening of Pink Ribbons Inc. And she's working there along with other committed activists. She's an associate tutor at the University of Sussex.
So this is really super quick, and if I speak really fast, you let me know, because I get very excited. So basically what I'm going to do today, very quick, I'm going to give 3 reasons why I think the Pink discourse. By Pink discourse today, I'm going to focus on the breast cancer awareness campaign. So I'm going to give you 3 reasons on why this is really toxic and we should change the language and the way we think about it. So before that, I need to stress that the main goal of breast cancer awareness campaign is to empower women. That's the main goal. And empowerment demands realistic, evidence-based and clear information about the real potential harm and benefits of the different therapeutic options. That is what empowerment means. However, at the present, the way that breast cancer awareness campaigns are rephrased undermines empowerment instead through fear-mongering, misinformation and trivialization of the disease. The first one, these discourses tend to use fear-mongering tactics that plays on women's fears. Fears about our potential race, how they can be carcinogenic. Fear that our children will lose their mothers, and also fear of being unhealthy because we lost the breast, or fear of dying. So they play on fear. Here is when misinformation is key. Statistics and personal narratives, often of celebrities, are distorted, misused, or left without content. They are taken out of context. Sometimes to simplify the message, sometimes just to attract audiences. The result is that we all have the impression that we are super convinced of getting breast cancer. But the fact is it's very delicate line. The fact is that breast cancer is not the leading cause of death for women, but it's the leading cause of fear because it's oversold. So here we have to be very careful how we phrase breast cancer. So it's not the main cause of death for women. For example, I give you two controversial messages that imply, that two controversial messages that we all the time hear from the campaign. The first is that we have a massive risk of having the carcinogenic gene, and this is very clear case in Angelina Jolie's now. This is false. Only 1% of the population, and 1% of the population have those genes. And about only 5-10% of cancers are genetic. So it's a very small minority, and the media portrays this as being, we are at super high risk. The second one, which is very problematic, is that mammograms don't, the message we get is mammograms prevent cancer, and mammograms, they don't prevent cancer, they help to detect cancer earlier, which is very problematic as well. But they don't prevent us from getting a tumor. In addition, screening detects about only 1/3 of cancers. Many cancers are not detected. And about 1/3 of all cancers that are diagnosed are not real cancers. So this is very problematic. And because these are not real cancers, still they are overtreated and overdiagnosed with all the consequences. More often than not, in the UK, in Spain, and in the States, that's what I know, women are still not informed of the risk before screening, nor of the poor quality of evidence about the screening, or whether we can benefit or not from screening in the long term. Yeah. Another toxic characteristic of the pink discourse is that it trivializes the disease on many levels. For example, when you look at the media and the adverts and the campaign, usually the women portrayed tend to be beautiful, young, happy, and healthy. Two things are here important. One, the risk of breast cancer increases with age, and average age of diagnosis is 61. So the idea that the young woman is more likely to be diagnosed is not true. And second, only 5% of cases occur in women under 40, which I think is really important, and the media doesn't portray it. Second issue, cancer is not sexy. It has a tremendous impact on women's health on a physical, emotional, and spiritual level, and yet, ill-looking women are encouraged by health professionals, sometimes with the family and charities, to use wigs, makeup, prostheses, and also to smile, to be pampered, to be beautiful, to regain the femininity. What happens with these women that they want to comply? Some women resist those pressures. These women often are labeled by health professionals again as depressed, butch, anti-erotic, or in denial. In denial is a psychiatric or psychological evidence. Anger in these discourses is not allowed. The representation of the cheerful woman limits our ability to comprehend what it's really like to face the disease, what it's like to live with medical uncertainty and accept the difficulties, realities of risk, pain, recurrence, treatment, disability, and even death. This is completely absent from the mainstream discourses. And the third one, which is really important, and we talk a little bit already, the third element, toxic element, is pinkwashing. Pinkwashing. According to the organization Breast Cancer Action, pinkwashing is when a company or organization that claims to care about breast cancer produce or sell products that are linked to the disease. Two clear examples that we already gave, but important to stress. Two clear examples are Estee Lauder Cosmetics. I don't know how you pronounce in English. Estee Lauder Cosmetics. And AstraZeneca Pharmaceutical. Both of them are hardcore promoters of this campaign. And yet, many of the Estee Lauder cosmetics contain carcinogenics. And also AstraZeneca that manufactures the cancer drug tamoxifen, which is very problematic, especially among many things because it produces the oil linked to endometrial cancer. Also, AstraZeneca that produces cancer drug also produces pesticides that they are linked to cancer. So,
Just to interrupt in that, AstraZeneca, run by ICI, that made Linde. So at one point, they were making Linde and they were making tamoxifen. ICI then sold off AstraZeneca, so...
Yes, more pinky things, including the pink warships. An important question as customers or collaborators or supporters with that is where does our money go? Many companies that sell pink products or promote them should donate a percentage of each sale to breast cancer programs, fail to indicate which programs are going to be chosen, so we really don't know where that money goes. And also we don't know how these organizations and programs spend the money, and we don't know if they go to truly address the root causes of breast cancer. This is something important that we should check. Other times, this is something customers don't know, other times companies that donate money to triple breast cancer programs put an arbitrary cap on their maximum donation. So once that the maximum amount has been met, the company might continue to sell the product, but without alerting customers that your money is not longer going to that place, because when it has reached, I don't know, £20,000, they might still sell in yours, money is not going to that cause, and this is something very important. So often, this means that you might be buying a product for which nothing of that money will go to the cancer cause, but to the company's pocket. And finally, something very, very important is rather than promoting fear about cancer and about women's bodies, how they might be carcinogenic, and also rather than promoting fear through lifestyle factors, putting the blame in the victim, I think we should think about what is really contributing to the spread of the disease and demand better information and more research. And I think that breast cancer is more than an epidemic of disease. It's an epidemic of political interest.